In a quiet town where time seemed to stand still, an aging German shepherd named Shadow and his war-scarred handler Walter uncover a young girl buried beneath the earth. That moment ignites a perilous journey into a hidden network of crimes tied to a long-buried betrayal from the battlefield. As gunfire, guilt, and redemption collide, Shadow becomes more than a rescuer. He becomes a bridge between past and healing. Through loyalty, silence, and unspoken strength, he saves not only the lost children but Walter's weary soul. Step into the story, Shadow's Watch. The memory in a dog's eyes. The sun was sinking behind the Appalachian Ridge, spilling its last amber rays across the wheat fields that lined the edges of Walter Hensley's property. He stood at the edge of his porch with a tin cup of lukewarm coffee, his posture as steady as the old wood beneath his boots. At 73, Walter's body bore the weight of years in uniform's stiff knees, a shoulder that clicked when the rain moved in, and scars from battles no one in town asked about anymore. But tonight, none of that ached as much as the silence. Beside him, resting with the kind of stillness only discipline can teach, lay Shadow, a retired German shepherd whose black and sable coat still gleamed in the dying light. Shadow had served 3 tours overseas as a military K9, and for the last 6 years, he had been Walter's shadow in more ways than just his name. They didn't talk much, one because he couldn't, the other because he'd said too much in his lifetime, but their bond spoke through glances and movement, a kind of language born from fire and loss. The wind picked up, rustling the tall stalks in the nearby fields. That's when Shadow stood up, ears high, nose twitching, eyes fixed on the far corner of the property where the wheat met the tree line. Walter narrowed his gaze. "You hear something, boy?" Shadow didn't answer. He was already moving. Within seconds, he'd leapt from the porch and disappeared into the golden sea of wheat. Walter dropped his cup and reached for his coat. His bones protested, but his instincts were sharper than ever. He followed, boots sinking into soft earth, heart thudding with an unease he hadn't felt since Kandahar. He heard it before he saw it. A rustling that didn't match the rhythm of the wind, a sound that suggested panic, breath, a muffled cry. When he finally pushed through the final stretch of stalks, he froze. Shadow was down on all fours, head low, tail stiff. He stood beside a shallow pit dug into the dirt. Inside it was a small figure barely moving, wrapped in a torn pink sweatshirt, wrists bound with duct tape. Mud caked her shoes. A canvas backpack had been tossed nearby, contents half spilled and damp. A child. Walter's heart stopped for half a beat. He dropped to one knee. "It's okay. You're safe now," he whispered, hands raised. The girl's eyes met his, wide and unblinking. She didn't scream, didn't speak. She only looked at Shadow. And Shadow, uncharacteristically, whimpered. Walter leaned forward slowly and reached to peel the tape from her wrists. She didn't resist, but she trembled like a leaf. Maybe 9 or 10 years old, pale, thin, dried blood on her sock. He lifted her gently. She barely weighed more than a bundle of hay. Shadow stayed close, pacing beside him with slow, deliberate steps, every muscle alert, not just watching the girl, watching the field. Walter carried her back to the house, pausing only once to scan the tree line. It was empty, but he knew what an empty trail felt like when it was still breathing. Someone had been here. Inside, he laid her down on the couch, wrapped her in a quilt, and called the sheriff. They arrived 20 minutes later, 2 cruisers, lights off, casual voices. Sheriff Griggs was a heavy-set man in his 50s, always more concerned with town affairs than field work. He stepped into the living room and looked at the girl. "You say you found her in your field?" he asked. "No," Walter replied. "My dog did." Griggs scratched his chin, unimpressed. "She talk yet?" "Not a word." They took her gently, promising to notify child services and get her checked by a nurse. Walter handed over the backpack. When they left, something in his chest didn't settle. Shadow didn't settle either. The old dog stood by the window, tail low, staring out into the dark like something hadn't followed them back but had never left either. That night, Walter lit a fire and sat beside Shadow. "You knew that girl wasn't there by accident, didn't you?" he muttered. Shadow looked up at him, then down again, as if remembering something. Walter stood and went to the closet. From a box buried beneath old boots and medals, he pulled out a folder. Inside were photos from his last deployment, one in particular with 4 soldiers and a young German shepherd pup, barely old enough for training. Behind them, a forward operating base, sun-blasted, war-hardened. Walter studied one of the faces next to him in the photo. The man had a crooked nose, a lazy eye, and a grin like he was always about to lie. He remembered that man's name, Gavin Leach. Dishonorably discharged. Vanished after court-martial. Walter looked at Shadow. "You smelled something out there, didn't you?" Shadow's ears perked just slightly. Walter stared into the fire. The wheat fields, the shallow grave, the silence of a child. This wasn't random. And somehow, Shadow had known it from the start. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and lavender soap. Somewhere down the hallway, a vending machine rattled as someone kicked it for eating their dollar. But inside room 214, there was only the hum of soft fluorescent light and the near-silent breathing of a girl who had not spoken a single word since she was found. Walter stood by the door, arms crossed. Shadow lay obediently at his feet, eyes never leaving the bed. The doctor had tried, so had the nurse. Even the hospital's in-house therapist, nothing. The girl, now confirmed to be named Sophie Callahan, age 10, wouldn't respond to questions. Wouldn't flinch when they checked her reflexes. She just watched the window, unmoving, as if her voice had been buried somewhere in that field and hadn't come back with her. Sheriff Griggs had stopped by earlier. All smiles. All surface. He'd called it a miracle she'd been found, promised the department would do its part to investigate. But Walter had seen the way the sheriff avoided looking Shadow in the eye. And he'd seen the way Griggs closed his notebook a little too fast when Walter mentioned the name Gavin Leach. Now it was just the 3 of them. Walter, Sophie, and Shadow. He stepped closer to her bed and lowered his voice. "You don't have to speak. Not yet. But I need you to listen." She blinked once, slowly. "I believe someone left you there on purpose. I don't know why. Not yet. But I don't trust the folks who say they're going to find out." Her eyes flicked toward Shadow. "He knew something was wrong before I did. That's how we found you." Shadow let out a small, low chuff, not a bark, not a whine, just presence. Walter knelt slowly beside him, his knees crackling like dry leaves. "I've seen girls your age in places they never should have been. Back in Helmond, it was a school bombed out by cowards. A girl walked through fire with her baby brother tied to her back. Never spoke again. But she had eyes like yours. Eyes that saw everything." Sophie didn't move. Walter didn't expect her to. Instead, he stood, took one long look, and left without a sound. That night, back at the farmhouse, Shadow circled the living room twice before lying down near the fireplace. Walter poured himself a bourbon but left it untouched. He opened the old deployment folder again. Inside were faded documents, tactical maps, an incident report with redacted names. But one file stood out: Leach Gavin R. Court-Martial, 2008. Accusation, dereliction of duty. Outcome discharged, case sealed. "Sealed my ass," Walter muttered. He remembered what wasn't in the file. The day they lost their medic because someone ignored protocol. That medic had a name. Annalise Dawes, 22. Bright-eyed. Grave. Gone. And Leach. He vanished stateside. Changed his name. Ghosted the system. But dogs remember what men try to forget. Walter turned to Shadow. "You smelled something out there. I know it. You stiffened like back in Marja." Shadow thumped his tail once, slowly, but didn't move. Walter stepped to the window and stared out across the dark fields. The wind had shifted again. Something was coming. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He picked up. A voice, gravelly and calm. "You're asking questions, Walt. Time to stop." Click. He stared at the phone. Then at the fire. Then at the photograph still pinned on the corkboard near the stairs. His squad. Thomas, Jim, Annalise, himself and a young Shadow, barely past puppyhood, ears too big for his head. Shadow had stood between bullets and breath more than once. Walter sighed. "We're going to need backup, boy." The old shepherd lifted his head. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a dog howled. And Shadow answered, not loud, not long, but enough to let the dark know. He remembered. Ty. And he was ready. It wasn't the kind of town where people vanished. Maple Hollow had one grocery store, 2 gas stations, and a post office where the same woman named Debra had handled every package since '95. People didn't disappear here, not unless someone wanted them to. Walter sat in the library's public records room, hunched over a dimly lit screen, flipping through digitized archives with fingers that had once handled M4 carbines, but now fumbled with a mousepad. He typed the name, Gavin Leach. Nothing. Then he tried what soldiers are trained to do, look for patterns, not names. He searched for land sales, alias employment licenses, background checks on town hires, and finally something clicked. A property purchased under the name GR. Lane 4 miles from his own land, registered 6 years ago. The digital deed showed a grainy headshot. Walter froze. The man in the photo wore glasses now. A beard. Age had added pounds and erased sharpness, but Walter's memory and Shadow's nose had no statute of limitations. Son of a, he muttered. He printed the file. As he left, he nearly collided with a teacher corralling 3rd graders on a school tour. They apologized. He barely noticed. Shadow waited in the truck, sitting with his head turned slightly toward the breeze. When Walter opened the door, Shadow gave a single, quiet growl, low and vibrating. Walter paused. You smell him again? Shadow turned his head, ears twitching, eyes fixed on the school down the block. Walter followed the gaze and saw him. Standing at the edge of the playground fence, talking to the janitor, was a man in a utility uniform, brown jacket, cap pulled low, gloved hands. From a distance, nothing stood out, but then he shifted his weight. A slight limp on the left, same as in Afghanistan after the roadside explosion. It was him. Gavin Leach was working at the elementary school. Walter's chest tightened. He clenched the steering wheel and whispered, he's hiding in plain sight. He drove home fast, careful to avoid being followed. He didn't call the sheriff. Not yet. He didn't know who was clean, who wasn't. But someone had to know Leach was back. Someone had helped him get the job. That night, he dug deeper into the old file Shadow's military service was in. Something Thomas, his old commanding officer, had marked with red pen. Unit Bravo 3 billion. Handler rotation with L. L for Leach. They'd been paired once. Just once. And something had gone wrong. Walter stepped outside into the cool night air. He lit a match but didn't smoke, just watched the flame flicker and die. Do you remember, boy? He asked quietly. Shadow, who had been lying by the porch, stood and walked to the yard's edge, ears erect. From across the field, in the dark, came a sound. Not barking. Not a vehicle. Just a whistle. 3 short blasts, patterned. Shadow froze. His body tensed. Walter's blood went cold. That whistle wasn't random. It was a command signal, one they hadn't used in over a decade. Don't move, Walter ordered, his voice low. But Shadow stepped forward. Not aggressively, but like someone trying to remember something impossible. Walter grabbed his flashlight and swept it across the field. Nothing. No movement. Only wheat dancing in the moonlight. He turned back to Shadow and saw it. The dog's eyes were glassy, focused somewhere else, not the field, but the past. Walter dropped to one knee. Hey, look at me. That's not your handler anymore. That man gave you up. He left you. Shadow looked back at him, blinked once and let out a sharp, clean bark. One. Just one. Recognition, but not obedience. They stood together for a long time. Then, without a word, Walter walked inside and locked every door. Shadow stayed by the window, watching the field, the night, the memory. Somewhere out there, a ghost from war had returned. And this time, Walter wouldn't be waiting for permission to act. The barn sat on the edge of a forgotten road, choked in tall grass and wild fennel. On paper, it was listed as a storage facility owned by a private contracting firm that hadn't operated since 2017. But Shadow stood frozen at its gate, the fur along his back rising like wind through wheat. Walter parked the truck 200 yards out, under cover of a dry creek bed. He checked his sidearm twice, though he knew that Shadow was the real weapon tonight. The old shepherd's breath was steady, eyes sharp, every muscle dialed in. This wasn't the dog that napped by the fireplace. This was the soldier. They crossed the field under cover of moonlight. No motion sensors. No alarms. Just silence that felt too curated. The front door was chained shut, but a side panel had rotted away just wide enough for a man and a dog to slip through. Inside, the barn smelled of oil, mildew, and something metallic. Walter swept the flashlight across the room. Empty crates, rusted shelves, wire spools. Nothing dangerous yet. But Shadow kept moving. Past the tractor husks, past the shelves until he stopped at the far wall. A sheet of plywood leaned against it, but it wasn't flush. Shadow scratched once, then looked back. Walter approached. Behind the board was a trap door, fitted with modern hinges, heavy-duty bolts. Recently used. He knelt and pressed his ear to the wood. A hum. Faint, steady. Generators. He looked at Shadow. Stay close. Then he opened it. The stairs descended into cold. Not damp, not musty like a root cellar, but sterile, processed. The kind of air you find in medical rooms and secret places. At the bottom, a corridor ran about 30 feet. Fluorescent bulbs flickered overhead. On the left, an electronic keypad door. On the right, a regular one. Walter tried the right. It opened with a soft creak. The room inside was a dormitory. 4 bunks, no windows. Thin blankets. Personal items, drawings. A doll missing its eye. A plastic dinosaur. Shadow sniffed the bedding and gave a sharp exhale. Not alarm recognition. "They've been here recently?" Walter whispered. He moved to the small desk against the wall. On it, a clipboard with a schedule. No names, just initials and time slots. AC8 PTMP silence training. At the bottom, rotate exit via route B. No phones. Walter's skin crawled. Shadow had gone to the far side of the room. He scratched again, this time at a steel plate set in the wall. Walter approached. It wasn't a vent. It was a hatch. And it was bolted from the outside. He hesitated, then unlatched it. The hatch swung open. Inside was a small compartment no bigger than a walk-in closet. No furniture. Just a bucket, a mattress, and a security camera angled from above. There were scratch marks on the walls. A sound caught behind them. Both man and dog turned at once. Footsteps. Walter moved fast, cutting the flashlight and pressing himself against the corridor wall. Shadow melted into shadow, invisible but ready. Voices. 2 men, one older, one younger. Talking about the next shipment and how the sheriff said to delay 2 more days. Walter's blood chilled. He peered around the corner. It was him. Leach. Older, heavier, with a clipboard in one hand and a keycard clipped to his belt. The other man was wiry, anxious, constantly adjusting his jacket. They passed without seeing him, disappearing into the electronic door. Walter exhaled slowly. Then he turned to Shadow. "We're not waiting for warrants." He took photos. The clipboard. The bunk room. The hatch. Then they slipped out the way they came up the stairs, through the side panel, back to the truck. But as they reached the fence line, Shadow froze. He barked once, then turned back toward the barn. A soft cry. So faint, Walter almost didn't hear it. Then again. A child's voice, muffled, calling from somewhere below the earth. Walter looked down. Shadow had stopped beside a second hatch, barely covered by brush. Walter knelt, pushed the leaves away, and found a rusted lock. He smashed it with a crowbar. Opened it. Inside was a girl, no older than 7, pale, thin. Her wrists were red from rope. Shadow whined and lay down, front paws extended, not approaching but inviting. The girl reached out and touched his head. And finally she smiled. Walter carried her to the truck, heart pounding. Shadow leapt into the bed beside them, standing guard like a statue carved from memory and bone. As they pulled away, a camera hidden in the barn's rafters turned and recorded their faces. The war had started again. Not with bullets this time, but with proof. And a dog who remembered what justice smelled like. The storm had been building all afternoon. By nightfall, clouds rolled over Maple Hollow like a black tide, heavy with electricity and silence. No rain yet, just the promise of it, thick in the air like sweat before a sprint. Walter adjusted the scope of the old hunting rifle he hadn't touched in 10 years. The weapon wasn't for attack, it was insurance. Shadow, beside him in the passenger seat, wore his old K9 vest again, the one with faded patches and a tear along the side from their last deployment. It still fit, and somehow, it still felt right. The girl they rescued, the second child, was safe at a shelter in the next county. No names were used. No questions asked. Walter didn't trust the local system anymore. Not when the sheriff's own voice was caught in the barn's corridor audio talking about delays and routes. He had sent a copy of the footage to a retired friend in military intelligence, but help wouldn't come in time. So tonight, it would be just him and Shadow. And whoever else waited in that bunker. They parked at the edge of the woods, far from the barn. No headlights, no sound but thunder rumbling from the hills. Walter moved first. Shadow followed without a word. Together they slipped through the tall grass, wind in their favor. The barn loomed like a carcass in moonlight. This time, the side panel was gone. Someone had been here. Recently. Inside, the air was different, cooler, staler, as if something had been shut down in a hurry. They crept down the stairs, Walter's boots soft against concrete. Shadow stayed close. At the corridor, Walter paused. The keypad door was ajar. The light inside flickered weakly. They entered. It was worse than he imagined. Rows of metal cells, each the size of a closet. 3 occupied. Children, none older than 12. 2 were asleep, curled against thin mattresses. 1 was awake, sitting up against the bars, eyes hollow. When she saw Shadow, she flinched, then froze. Slowly, she reached a hand out. Shadow stepped forward and nudged her fingers gently. That was when the alarm tripped. A siren. Not loud, but urgent. Motion sensor. Or. Walter cursed under his breath. We've got company. He started unlocking the cells. Shadow stood guard at the corridor entrance, teeth bared. The door slammed open. Leach. Behind him, 2 armed men in civilian gear. Walter ducked behind a pillar. The girl screamed. Shadow launched. The first guard didn't see him coming. 70 pounds of fury slammed into his ribs, sending him flying against the wall. The man screamed as Shadow latched onto his forearm, controlled but devastating. The second guard raised his weapon. Walter stepped from cover. 1 shot. Center mass. The man fell. Leach froze. Walter advanced, gun raised. You want to reach for something, Gavin? He said. Leach held his hands up, but his eyes darted. You don't understand, this goes higher than me. I don't care how high it goes. It stops here. Shadow released the downed guard and stood beside Walter, panting, fur matted with sweat and blood. Leach sneered. You think this ends with a hero moment? You'll disappear before sunrise. Walter pressed the barrel against his temple. No, but you might. Suddenly a sound from behind. A door slammed. The girl screamed again. Smoke. Flashbang. Walter Dove. Shadow leapt toward the nearest child, curling around her. The room exploded in light. When the smoke cleared, Walter's ears rang. His hands found the girl beneath Shadow alive. The others? Coughing. Alive. Shadow limped now. A cut above his hind leg, bleeding but not deep. His eyes were locked on the rear corridor, where the last figure had fled. Walter scooped up the smallest child and barked, "We're moving." Now. Shadow took point, ignoring pain, leading them up the stairs. Outside, the wind had picked up. Rain fell in angry streaks. The truck was still there, engine still cold. Walter loaded the children in. Shadow climbed into the back, body shaking but alert. As they drove, lights appeared on the ridge. Police cars. But not local. State troopers. His old friend had come through. They stopped the truck at the checkpoint. A trooper approached, recognized Walter, looked in the back and his face changed. "Jesus," the man whispered. "They said you were exaggerating." Walter looked him in the eye. "I undersold it." Shadow stood tall in the bed, blood drying on his leg, rain washing over his face. The trooper turned to the others. "Get medics. Now." As Walter stepped out, one of the children clung to his coat. "Is he going to be okay?" she asked, pointing to Shadow. Walter knelt beside her. "He's been through worse. But you're safe now." Behind them, red and blue lights flashed across the barn. Officers swarmed. Leach was gone, but his world was collapsing. And in the bed of a truck, a war dog closed his eyes, knowing the mission was not over, but this battle was won. The rain hadn't stopped. Outside the emergency clinic, water beat against the tin roof in rhythmic, insistent drumming, the kind that settles into your bones and makes silence heavier than sound. Inside, Walter sat alone in the waiting room. His hands were clenched between his knees, not shaking, just tense, like a soldier waiting for the next command that wouldn't come. Behind the steel door labeled K9 Emergency, Shadow was being treated. The leg wound was deeper than they thought. Possible nerve damage. Internal bleeding. The vet, a woman named Dr. Nia Patel, had said, "He's strong, but he's old. He's fought more battles than most of us ever will. It's up to him now." Walter hadn't replied. He just nodded once. The kind of nod that meant, then he'll fight one more. A folder sat on the chair beside him. Unmarked. Delivered by a state trooper 2 hours ago. Inside were declassified documents. Everything Leach had buried. At 2:14 hours, Walter opened the file. And the past unfolded like a map soaked in blood. Photos first, grainy shots from Afghanistan, forward operating base Shemshir, 2010. Training runs, debrief sessions, Shadow as a pup beside two men, Walter and Thomas Holloway. And another figure, Leach. But younger, lean, smiling. Too confident. Too clean. Then the documents. Redacted pages. But not all of them. There it was, Operation Grey Door. An off-the-books asset transport mission. Only 5 men involved. 1 K9 unit. No official records. No command chain. Just cash intel and a missing convoy. Walter remembered now. He wasn't chosen for that mission. But Thomas was. So was Leach. Shadow 2 barely out of basic training. It was supposed to be a secure transport. No contact. In and out. But the convoy never made it. Only one man returned. Leach. And his story didn't match what Walter saw weeks later when he and his squad found a half-buried supply vehicle, burned out and empty. No bodies. Just a single patch from Thomas's uniform, melted into the floor. They said it was an ambush. But the file said different. Leach rerouted the convoy. For profit. Sold intel to a local group. The others caught on too late. When they tried to stop him, he vanished. Shadow had been with them. And he survived. He was found 3 days later, bloodied, shaking, with a laceration above his eye, the same scar he bore now. Walter whispered aloud. He watched them die. Shadow never spoke, but he never forgot. And now the man who betrayed them was still out there. And he had run again. But not cleanly. In the back of the file was a photo taken only hours earlier by Highway Patrol. A van. Wrecked. Abandoned near the state line. In the front seat, a badge from the same private security firm Leach had used as a front, and taped beneath the dashboard. A photograph. It was old. Fated. 4 soldiers. And a young dog. On the back, written in ink barely legible. They trusted me. That's what made it easy. Walter closed the file. He stood slowly, walked to the recovery window. Dr. Patel met him with tired eyes. "He's awake," she said. Walter entered quietly. Shadow lay on the table, bandaged but alert. One leg raised slightly, IV in his paw. But his eyes, the eyes that had seen betrayal, war, children in cages, were steady. Walter approached. "You knew before any of us," he whispered. Shadow blinked once. Walter sat beside him. "You saw him that day in the field. You remembered the smell, the walk, the lie." Shadow didn't move. Walter opened his phone and pulled up the map. The barn had been raided. The tunnel systems uncovered. More children found. But Leach, gone. Except one pin dropped on the map. A cabin. In the mountains. No road access. Only trails. Walter turned the screen to Shadow. "You up for one more?" Shadow shifted his paw. Just enough to touch Walter's hand. Outside, the storm broke. And with it, the last wall Walter had kept around his heart. It wasn't revenge anymore. It was a reckoning. The sky above Raven Ridge was cut by dawnlight, narrow streaks of gold slicing through the mist like cracks in a wall, too long held up by silence. Walter's boots pressed into the wet earth of the mountain trail, his breath measured, eyes forward. Each step felt both heavy and inevitable. He carried no rifle this time, only a sidearm and a leash. But the leash hung slack. Because Shadow walked freely beside him, limping slightly but with that same military gait, head low, shoulders squared, scanning. Every movement was purposeful, even now. Especially now. The cabin was a half-mile ahead. He'd found it through coordinates hidden in the van's GPS encrypted. Yes, but sloppily. Leach had been rushing. Running scared. He wasn't hiding from the law anymore. He was hiding from the dog that remembered. The trail narrowed. Pine needles dampened each footfall. No birds, no wind. Too quiet. Walter raised a fist. Shadow stopped instantly. Then dropped to a crouch. They both heard it. A click. Tripwire. Walter knelt and found it, fine wire strung low across 2 stumps. Crude but enough to warn or wound. He cut it gently. They moved forward, slower now. The cabin came into view minutes later, hunched beneath a canopy of crooked trees, windows boarded, chimney cracked. Smoke rose faintly. He was there. Walter didn't knock. He stepped onto the porch, pushed the door open. Inside, darkness and dust. And a voice. "I was wondering when you'd come." Leach stepped from the shadowed hallway, holding a pistol loosely at his side. His beard was fuller now, eyes sunken, hollow. Like something had been scraped out long ago. Walter said nothing. Shadow growled once. "That dog," Leach murmured. "He always knew too much." "You left them to die," Walter said. Not loud, just true. They were already dead. The op was burned the moment command signed off on it. I just got out early. You got out rich? Leach smirked. Money doesn't spend well in hell, Walt. You think I don't pay for it every night? Walter took a step forward. Leach raised the gun. Don't. I'm not here for a standoff. I'm here to end something. You think that mutt remembers? Dogs don't hold grudges. Shadow stepped between them. And for a long second, no one moved. Then Leach flinched. Shadow growled low and deep. I watched him tear into a man in Kandahar, Leach said, stepping back. Didn't bark, didn't blink. Just did what he was trained to do. He wasn't trained to kill, Walter said. No, Leach replied. He was trained to protect. And then, gunshot. But not from Leach. From outside. A warning shot. Walter ducked. Leach spun, confused. Shadow launched. He didn't go for the throat. He went for the gun just like he'd been taught. The weapon clattered to the floor. Walter kicked it away. Leach stumbled back, clutching his side where Shadow's jaws had connected. "You think this ends here? You think?" Walter struck him across the face. Once. Leach dropped. Bleeding, but alive. Outside, footsteps rushed in state agents. The backup Walter had texted only an hour earlier. His old friend had sent a team. Clean. Silent. As they entered the cabin, they froze at what they saw: a decorated veteran, a battered fugitive, and a dog standing between them, breathing steady, eyes locked on the man who had betrayed him a lifetime ago. "Take him," Walter said. And just like that, Leach was in cuffs. Shadow sat down, panting softly, eyes never leaving the door as they led the man away. One of the agents knelt. "That's one hell of a dog." Walter nodded. He doesn't forget. But today he forgave. That evening, Walter and Shadow sat on the ridge. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows between the trees. Walter spoke softly. "We lost a lot, didn't we?" Shadow didn't move. Just lay beside him, the way he had since the first mission, since the first silence. "But we saved more than we lost. This time." A breeze moved through the pines. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried. And for the first time in years, Walter exhaled without armor. Beside him, Shadow closed his eyes and rested. 2 weeks later, the town of Maple Hollow felt different. Not louder, not busier, just more awake. News of the rescue had spread beyond state lines. Investigations were underway. Names fell. Resignations piled up. And the people who had once whispered in coffee shops about Walter Hensley now stopped him on the street with gratitude in their eyes and hands that lingered too long on Shadow's head. But Walter never bragged. He said little. He let the silence speak for itself. Shadow's injury would never fully heal. The nerve damage meant one back leg would always drag slightly, especially in cold weather, but he adapted. No complaints, just new rhythms. Dr. Patel offered options therapy, prosthetics, but Walter politely declined. "He's earned the limp," he said. "Let him carry it." Shadow still rose early. Still did his patrol around the farm. Still curled beside Walter's boots every evening when the porch lights flicked on and the stars returned like loyal ghosts. But something had changed in him too. He no longer stared out into the fields like he was waiting for something to return. Now he looked toward the house. Toward what was here. One Saturday morning, a small yellow school bus pulled into Walter's gravel driveway. It wasn't full. Only 5 kids stepped off, escorted by 2 volunteers from the local outreach program. They were the first class, the Shadow Project. Each child had come from something dark: foster care, trauma, loss. And each week they'd spend time at the farm learning how to read aloud to animals. Walter had built a long wooden bench under the cedar tree beside the barn, shaded and quiet. He kept books in an old ammo crate and bowls of dog treats by the edge of the porch. Shadow would choose where to sit, and the children would find him. Some read clearly, some mumbled through tears, but Shadow never judged. He just listened. That evening, Walter found something at the gate. A small brass plaque, freshly nailed into the fence post. No name, just a quote. He protected without needing to be asked. He remembered so we could forget. He watched, and the world was better for it. Walter didn't know who left it. But he stood there a long time, one hand resting on the worn wooden rail, the other on Shadow's head. "You've still got more work to do, partner," he murmured. Shadow thumped his tail twice, then turned toward the barn. The children were waiting. Later that fall, as leaves turned copper and the air tasted like distant firewood, Walter sat in his armchair by the window, watching as the last class of the season climbed back onto the bus. One boy stopped and ran back down the steps. He hugged Shadow without warning, burying his face in the dog's fur. "I never had anyone stay," the boy whispered. Shadow didn't move, just leaned in slightly and breathed, like he was remembering too. The boy smiled, then ran back to the bus. Walter looked down at his companion. "You didn't just guard this place," he said softly. "You brought it back to life." Shadow gave no reply, but he didn't need to. Outside, the wind carried the scent of pine and earth and memory. Inside, two soldiers, one with scars on his skin, the other with them in his eyes, sat together in the quiet. And the world, if only for a moment, felt whole again. Thank you so much for staying with us through this unforgettable journey. If this story touched your heart, reminded you of the silent heroes among us human or canine, please consider subscribing to our channel. We have many more stories of courage, healing, and second chances waiting to be told. Don't forget to like, comment, and share with someone who needs a little hope today. Join us here, where every story has a heartbeat.